on September 10th, I use that date, right, to illustrate before the boom, right? There were 4 fighter units in the entire continental United States that had the mission of air defense. So air defense the mission is defend America against air-breathing targets, meaning something in the air coming at you. Could be a missile, could be an airplane. And so in the Cold War, we had hundreds of airplanes designed to do air defense, all commanded through the North American Air Defense Command, NORAD, headquartered at Colorado Springs, Cheyenne Mountain. And that is the only, I believe, bi-national command that we have, because when we say North American, we're including Canada in that, right? So the problem was, the tactical, strategic problem was Russian bombers coming over the North Pole, and NORAD had all these fighters, NORAD, Canadian and U.S. fighters, tankers ready. We had radars all along the northern Canadian coastline, some out over in Greenland. The Greenland, Iceland, UK gap is an area that concerned a lot of people. And so we had all this infrastructure during the Cold War. After the wall falls, right, the Soviet Union disintegrates, we start to take the peace dividend, and all that infrastructure starts to become defunded, and we start ratcheting down to have very limited capability, which takes us all the way to September 10th, and all that's left are 4 in the 4 corners, 4 fighter units and some tanker units that are ready to mobilize, and that wasn't enough. It was designed to respond to threats that are coming from far away. We thought we'd be able to see them. It wasn't a system that was designed to find and target threats that were coming from inside our borders. Huge difference. Again, part of the massive failure. The morning of 9/11, that was Tuesday, as we all know, the week before, we had come back from a training deployment to Las Vegas. We called them red flags. And those are very intense 2-week exercises that everybody goes to. And that was the mode at the time. You take everybody out there and you really get a good brush up on the tactics that you're going to use in any kind of combat scenario, weapons employment, and so forth and so on. So I say that because most of the squadron wasn't on the base at the time, and we just had the skeleton crew, and I was in charge of the skeleton crew at the time, and we had a scheduler and a training officer, and that morning we are trying to reconstitute. Everybody's gone, but they're going to come back at some point once they've touched base with their employers, right? That's a big part of how the National Guard is built, is most of the people, the pilots and the maintainers and all the support staff, are part-timers. So when you ask them to go on a long 2-week trip, they got to come back, check in with their bosses, spend a little bit of time, and then they'll come back and get into a training cycle. And that's what we're putting together. And we're in the process of building the following week's schedule, trying to figure out who's going to be here when. The meeting's interrupted by Dave Callahan. He says, "Hey, you guys ought to look and see what's on TV." And so we left the meeting room and go into the break room, if you will. And sure enough, there's one of the trade towers on fire, smoking. Incredible, shocking, obviously. And we start to process, what does this mean? Is this an accident? Did somebody get a bad vector? Was there an airplane malfunction? You just start to think through what the cause could be. And we're not really thinking of reacting yet. We're not there in the thought process. It's more, oh my God, what just happened? So things progressed throughout the morning in very rapid succession. The second airplane hits, and as soon as that happens, we know we rule out all the accidental, we rule out the bad luck, you rule out the bad weather, bad air traffic control, and now we realize that we're under attack. And about the same time, what's happening is the White House Joint Operations Center, we had a relationship with. We had a relationship with the Special Service, or the Secret Service, that helped secure the airfield for presidential movements, and they were in the JOC that day. A little bit of a side note on that, the relationship was very important because there are many things that happen on Andrews Airfield. The two more germane to this conversation is our operation flying fighters out of there, and then Air Force One and Air Force Two, and so forth and so on. And so the Secret Service liked to control the airfield, and so we wouldn't take off when Air Force One is landing or taking off. We wouldn't land when Air Force One is taking off or landing. And so we had a great arrangement. We knew them. And once we made contact, Dan Kane makes contact with the White House JOC to find out, hey, what's going on? That's when they ask, can you get anything airborne? Come to find out later on that what the White House JOC had seen was the air traffic control flow, and they saw one track that was basically heading west, turn around and do a button hook, looks like a fish hook, and then stops. That's what they were reacting to, and they knew that that stopped near where the river would pick up, the Potomac River would pick up. So their question was, we think we see something coming down the river, can you get anything in the air? So we respond immediately. 3 of our airplanes had just come back and had landed after a training mission. Normally it was 4, but again, since people had gone back to their employers, 3 was all we could put up that one morning for the training sortie. So Billy Hutchison, who has 800 pounds of gas in an F-16, which to anybody driving a car means you're on E. Literally, you're on E. We ask him to see if he can get back up in the air, fly up the river, see if he sees anything, and then he turns around and comes back. He doesn't see anything. He's got his radar looking low because that's where we expected it to be. He turns around and comes back and lands below E. Obviously, he couldn't go very far and couldn't do anything because he didn't have any weapons. And, that wasn't the task at the time. Do you see anything? Meanwhile, myself, Dan Kane, who's now chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Brandon Rasmussen, who was an active duty pilot that was spending time with us to get flight hours and experience, and that was a common thing back in those days, and actually it still is today. And number 4 was Lucky Penny, one of the new hires into the squadron. So we organize ourselves. I basically lay out the structure, and I ordered us, and that was the order of experience. I had the most experience, Lucky had the least, and so I paired myself and Lucky and had Dan and Igor, that was his call sign, Raisin and Igor, wait, because I knew that we didn't have weapons. So I said, Lucky and I are going to run out there, establish a combat air patrol, which is a combat term, obviously, and so basically what that involves is flying over a geographic piece of terrain and looking with your radar and your eyeballs for anything coming at you. The better your radar, the farther you can see. The higher you go, the farther you can see, and so that's beneficial. But we knew that this was going to be a close-in scenario. So Lucky and I get airborne as soon as we can. Once we get airborne, things start to crystallize in my mind. I don't know what the threat is. I don't have any weapons. I don't have any rules of engagement yet. They come, and from the vice president, we get weapons free. And we really don't have any tactics. We did know that 2 airplanes had crashed before we took off, and I had a conversation with Lucky. Okay, when we get airborne, if we come up across an airliner that's intent on, and how do we know? Well, we had to think through that as well. That's intent on being used as a weapon. I'll take the front of the airplane, you take the tail of the airplane, and I kind of left it at that. I didn't really explain what take meant. We get airborne, and the radio is just blaring. We're looking for traffic that's hasn't gotten the word that everybody needs to be landed, which had been put out. So we're seeing some TV station helicopters, probably some police traffic, and there's general aviation traffic as well, just flying around. And we spent a lot of time essentially shooing them away. But we had to split up to do that because there was so much. And so that's the point where I realized my idea of taking one part of the airplane and the other part isn't going to work. So it's going to be a single shot. And thinking through how I was going to take down an airplane without weapons was kind of a challenge and a little bit of a trick. I knew about airliners because I had been a Delta pilot, and so I knew where the redundancies were, I knew where the weaknesses of the airplane were, I knew where the strengths were, and had a pretty good idea of what it would take to bring one down. So the plan that I concocted in my mind was I was going to have to hit it. And I did have the training bullets. Those training bullets are just lead slugs. What you prefer in combat is the combat round, which has a fuse in it and explodes when it hits something. And that obviously causes much more damage and is much more effective in destroying the target, whether it's another airplane or something on or attached to the ground. So I realized that I was going to have to hit it, and I came up with the idea of hitting the wing, destroying the aerodynamic capabilities. The things that are going through my mind are, first of all, it's a plane full of people, American citizens, mostly, probably. So I had to do that calculation of the needs of the few versus the needs of the many, right? That ethical conundrum. The idea of hitting it at the right time and making that decision early rather than late, getting in position. We hadn't trained against this kind of a threat. Now, in the Cold War and back in my Torrejon days when we would deploy to Turkey, we knew that the Russians had bombers, and so we did a little bit of work on how would you intercept a Russian bomber and where were the soft spots and how would you attack one. So we knew a little bit about taking big airplanes down, but I had to go through that thought process. And so the first 2 hours, and that's all we really had gas for, Lucky and I are chasing airplanes down, and thankfully we didn't have to ram any. But we didn't know, right? We didn't know how many other airplanes were coming our way, were still airborne. It was just a very, very uncomfortable time. The one thing I'll remember from that first sortie, though, the thing that sticks on my mind is right after takeoff, I'm still trying to get the cockpit set up. I needed to get airborne as soon as possible. So I flew over the Pentagon. Billy had flown already over the Pentagon and come around and landed. I flew a little bit higher than he did. So the first one that everybody sees is Billy. I was higher. I don't think many people saw me. And I can smell the fumes from the fire, the concrete, the gas that's burning, everything else that's burning inside of that section of the Pentagon. It's not smoke. My vision isn't occluded, but I can just smell it. And that just triggered my brain-gut relationship where my stomach just fell, and I said, oh my God, how did we miss this? We failed. We got attacked. We had no idea this was happening. And that's a memory that I'll take to the grave.
So later in the day, there's a commercial aircraft ground stop, of course. Everything's grounded. But at that time, as you mentioned, they're still coming in and landing. That plane that had been identified for doing the button hook, were you getting regular updates on where that particular plane was?
Thank you for asking. That was Flight 93. Mm-hmm. So that button hook, where that hook ends, we estimate is the crash site. What the White House had thought was maybe that's where they pull the circuit breakers, because they were aviators inside that, so they knew aviation. And so they had thought that maybe the black box, the identification friend or foe that transmits a signal that allowed them to see that track was turned off. The way you turn it off is by pulling the circuit breakers, and that they had gone low and were sneaking into Washington, D.C., low altitude that nobody would see it. So like I said, they didn't communicate that. We find out about that much later, that's what they saw and that's what they were concerned about. So to answer your question, no, we weren't getting updates. They saw that. They said, can you get airborne? That's what we went after. But the time delay, even if we had gone all the way up there, they had crashed much earlier than that. And while I'm on Flight 93, I got to tell you, I'm here to tell my side of the story. So is Dan Kane and Agor and Billy and all the maintainers that were a part of this, Tony Russell, Cheatham, the leadership, Jeff Johnson, George Degnan, all the pilots that participate in this. So we're the survivors. We tell the story. But there's a plane full of American heroes that did the unthinkable and took that plane down. And if that hadn't happened, if they hadn't done that, if they didn't take that action, we might be in a very different place today. So Lucky and I land, and everybody wants to know what the hell's going on. We run up to the Air National Guard headquarters, which is also based at Andrews. I mentioned there are a lot of entities that operate out of Andrews. Air National Guard headquarters is one of them. We just drive up the street a couple miles, maybe not even that, and we sit and we debrief what happened on the mission and explain to them what the air environment's like, what assets are airborne and available. We get a hot dog and a soda, and we go back and get back in the airplanes and take off again. So on that second sortie, by now, we've got missiles that have been pulled out of the bomb dump, and we call it a bomb dump, weapons, ammo storage area, to be correct. And by the way, after we landed, Dan Kane and Brandon Rasmussen take off. Now they have weapons, right? So they can actually action something if it comes across. So they've assembled them, put them together, and they've loaded them on our airplanes. We take off again. There's also a tanker airborne, and there's also a flying gas station, right? We can stay airborne longer if we connect. And an AWACS, an airborne warning and control system, which is the big airplane with the dome that turns on top of it. That's a giant radar and gives us a great picture, better than what Washington Tower would have even, of what's going on in the area. And they do the command and control. They tell us where things are, who else is airborne. They authenticate us, make sure we know who we're talking to, they know who we are, so forth and so on. And so we get back into our cap. A couple F-15s from Langley are now in the cap, and I use the cap term loosely because it's just the area over Washington, D.C. And we're only in there for a couple minutes when the controller wants to communicate with me about an airplane coming in. So part of the challenge of us not being part of the NORAD system, not being one of the 4 units, I guess I didn't mention that, but we were not part of the NORAD system at that time. We didn't have, the crypto, the communications codes to be able to talk to secret. And if you want to talk secret, the communication requires you to have the same code. We didn't have those codes. They weren't loaded in the airplane. That was rectified within a few days, obviously, but that wasn't the case at the time. So he communicates to me in a very low voice, trying to evade telling me in the clear, to Vector 270 for 120 miles or 140 miles, I guess it was. Meaning go west for over 100 miles, and the mission is to escort Air Force One back. So what had happened was President Bush had been notified. He was in Florida at a elementary school, and he had been notified of the attack. And then the day started unfolding for him. He was moved around several places in the United States all day long. And then finally he decides, okay, it's time to come back and I need to get back to D.C. And so I think the Enterprise probably stalled a little bit. I'm just guessing, making sure that the environment's safe. And now it's safe enough, but they wanted a fighter escort. NORAD Command wanted a fighter escort. So we leave the cap. We leave the area. I bring the 2 F-15s out with me and Lucky, and we go out to the west, waiting to pick up U.S. Air Force One. And we find them. There's another Learjet up at altitude that the F-15s commit out on early because we didn't know if we didn't know anything at that point. We weren't going to take anything for granted, and air traffic control wasn't talking to them. So they go investigate, and they come back. And so now the task is to get back into Andrews, and I get the frequency for the Air Force One so I can talk to them, right, as a Victor frequency. We start exchanging and finding out what his plan is. He goes, okay, we're going to go to Andrews and do a straight-in, meaning, you know, a normal landing, probably a little bit drug out. So I put the wingman out in front to see if she can see anything on the ground, because, again, we don't know if there are other airplanes waiting for us, if there are assets on the ground that intend to use surface-to-air missiles to make things difficult. Worse, shoot at Air Force One again, if they're intent on doing that. So I put Lucky 10 miles out in front, and she's going to stay in front, station keeping with a new machine, new computer equipment that we had just gotten on the F-16. And she lands, or she doesn't land, she clears the airfield. Air Force One lands, and I get back up on top, and we send the F-15s back up high and continue flying for that next 2 or 3 hours. But that was unique because Air Force One doesn't like to be escorted, and they're very, understandably so, they're very concerned about other airplanes getting too close. And so as I'm on the wing, I'm thinking, wow, this is a very unique time in history, very unique circumstances that, the country needs a fighter escort. It's been determined by authorities that the president needs a fighter escort to get back to his capital, and that I'm the one doing it with my wingman, right? Surreal moment.
Yeah, definitely. Now, by the time he came back, had pretty much all commercial air traffic been grounded in the area?
Yes, this is close to the end of the day. I don't have the exact time. I want to say around 4 or 5 p.m., somewhere in there. So the airspace is under control for the most part by that time.
When you think back to the fact that you were given this order to get up there without weapons, and you follow the order implicitly, understanding what's happening or trying to understand what's happening in the moment, you instinctively are ready to give your life for your country. I mean, that's part of signing up for the military, certainly, but in that moment, it's actually being asked of you. Whether you've thought about it in that moment or whether you've thought about it in the years since then, what comes to mind about that?
I want to say that I was a product of those years. So it's kind of odd to think when I went to the Air Force Academy in 1981, that was less than 10 years after the Vietnam War ended. So there's still a lot of chatter about what happened in Vietnam and all the heroism that happened, and how many people did some very brave things in the air, on the ground, on the seas, right? And you learn that at the academy. You learn what heroism is about. You learn the risks that people take. And you, as a young man or woman, I think, ask the same question, why? What is it? And I think it really just comes down to having believing in the cause. And if you believe in America, and you know that freedom isn't free, it sounds very cliche, but it costs to maintain what we have. We're a commercial nation. We have democratic values. We're not perfect. But from my experience as a young person living overseas, we've probably got it better than just about everybody else. Just about everybody else, not everybody. And the only way that you do that is by defending it and protecting it. So to put myself in that position wasn't as hard at the time, with the panic and everybody and the confusion. Wasn't as hard, I don't think, as we make it out to be, and I think a lot of people would have done the same thing.